I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I shall say this all in my best English accent. Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 to 17. A record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Solomon the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam the father of Abijah, Abijah the father of Asa, Asa the father of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat the father of Jehoram, Jehoram the father of Uzziah, Uzziah the father of Jotham, Jotham the father of Ahaz, Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, Manasseh the father of Ammon, Ammon the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, Abiud the father of Eliakim, Eliakim the father of Azor, Azor the father of Zadok, Zadok the father of Achim, Achim the father of Elihud, Elihud the father of Eleazar, Eleazar the father of Mathan, Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. Thus, there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile in Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Christ.
You'll all be really pleased today's sermon's on the base list of names. I'm just going to change my glasses so I can read my notes. It also means you're all in soft focus, so I can't tell if you've fallen asleep. How many of you enjoy watching things like Who Do You Think You Are and DNA Story and things like that? Yeah? Yeah, I quite enjoy those programmes too. On the run-up to various events, you tend to get adverts for Ancestry UK, going, get to know your DNA, get to know your history, where you come from, who you are. And then they're hoping that you're going to kind of buy into Ancestry UK and do your family tree and find out something of where your family story is, and get to know where you might consider yourself from. And there's always some really interesting things that get turned up. I always think when they go through various people's kind of family trees and who do you think you are, I wonder if they're going through them going, there's nothing interesting in this family. we're not going to use them. We'll just quietly put them to one side. Whereas this family here is really good. There's lots of juicy gossip, murder and intrigue. We are definitely running a programme on them. And I do wonder if that's how they choose it. But if they were going to do anybody's family tree, they really should have done Jesus' family tree, because the murder and intrigue in that story makes EastEnders seem tame. So, Jesus' family tree. Matthew's account is different to Luke's. There are different names. There are different things going on here. But Matthew is really wanting to point us to who Jesus is. And there's a few things we need to take note before we delve into these names and get lost in the murder, bloodshed, and adultery that is in Jesus' family tree. He starts by calling it a genealogy. This is the source, this is the origin, this is why Jesus can claim to be who he is. And Matthew is underlining why Jesus can be called a king. He chooses to use the kingly line of David to show who Jesus is. But his maths is not great. If you sit and count the names, you will realise that it's not 3 lots of 14, but it's actually, the first lot is a 14 including David's name. The second lot, if you include David's name, is a 15, so you have to drop David's name. And the third lot, if we've now decided we're not doing repeat names, is a 13, because we can't repeat Jeconiah's name, because he's put in twice. So, and if we do include Jeconiah's name, we then have to include Jesus to make it up to 14. So it's all kind of a bit skewy, but we're going to lay that to one side, because actually nobody knows why Matthew has made a point of it being 3 lots of 14. What the symbolism is there. There's lots of conjecture, and I'm not going to go down that route. I'm not going to give you lots of conjecture as to whether it's to do with the letters and the numbers of the Hebrew writing and stuff like that. I'm not going there today. There's also, in the middle section, 4 missing kings. There's 3 missing between Jehoram and Uzziah. And there's 1 missing further on between, I was going to say Josiah and Jeconiah. Jehoiakim. Or Jehoiakim. Anyway, there are 4 missing kings. If Matthew had put them in, that would have made the middle section 18. But they're missing, and they're missing for a reason. And again, Matthew doesn't tell us why they're missing. So one of the things with Jewish genealogy, you will do your family tree, but you might miss out some black sheeps in your family tree. Or you might miss out the boring ones in your family tree, the ones that haven't achieved anything spectacular or interesting. So you might find that actually a grandfather or a great-grandfather is listed as father too. So when you're reading the Old Testament and the names are there, those names are there because these are people of importance and of interest. But also the names that aren't there might be because they really were bad, or they really were not that interesting in the storyline. Not something that not necessarily that they're forgotten, but actually when you're telling a story through the genealogy, the names that are there are the ones that you want to carry the story. So, let's delve in to this book, this genealogy. There are 5 women mentioned in it. It makes it almost unique. Mary, the mother of Jesus, being the 5th. So let's start. Is there water? Yeah. Let's start with Abraham. Abraham was called by God out of Ur. I always think that's a great name for a place. It's like, which come from Ur. He had a unique relationship with God. He ate with the angel of the Lord. He spoke candidly to the angel of the Lord about Sodom and Gomorrah. He interceded on behalf of those towns. He entered into a covenant relationship with God, a bit like a marriage agreement, where in this one, all the risks are on God's side. There are no risks for Abraham. This is, if you think about it, the kind of relationship we would all long to have, where we can sit and actually eat with God, where we can sit and have a conversation about the place that's on our hearts, and it can go back and forth, and we can hear what God is saying, and we can put our point of view forward. This is the kind of relationship we would all long to have with God. But it's not a perfect relationship that Abraham has. You see, Abraham doesn't actually fully trust God to fulfill the promise that he has made, and he takes things into his own hands. He lies about his wife in order to protect himself. He takes Sarah's maidservant in order to try and ensure that God's plan comes to fruition. He does things his own way, and God has to step in and point out that he's not getting it right. You see, at times, the waiting for Abraham is so long that he loses sight of God's faithfulness. And he decides to do it his own way. But God does not give up on Abraham. God is faithful to his promises. And Isaac is born. Now, when I was looking up about Isaac, it's interesting because I was thinking there must be a really good story about Isaac. And it says, on his own, Isaac achieved nothing in particular. It's not a great statement about someone, is it? But actually, Isaac is famous because he's the son of Abraham. And I don't know how many people here go with, oh, you must be so-and-so's child. And actually, it's your father or your mother that is more famous and more popular, and you're known as just as being with them. And then the other thing that is Isaac's claim to fame is that he's Jacob's dad. So he went from somebody's son to now being somebody's dad. It's like when you're at toddlers, I'm really good at toddlers at remembering children's names, and you become the child's mother or father. Isaac, unfortunately for him, goes from being the child of to the father of. It's like he gets lost in the story, but he is still there. And what is interesting about Isaac is when Jacob describes him, it says this, the fear of his father Isaac. You see, what Jacob was describing is that Isaac had a fear and a reverence for God that stayed with him throughout his life. He had a love of God that was there, that when Jacob spoke of his father, he spoke of how his father feared and had reverence for God. In the story with Isaac going up the hill with his father, we often focus on Abraham. But it was Isaac that carried the wood. It was Isaac that allowed himself to be bound with ropes. It was Isaac who saw the knife come down. It was Isaac who heard God's voice as the angel of the Lord provided an alternative sacrifice. It was Isaac who was saved. And that stayed with Isaac throughout his life. God's promise was always there. We then come to Jacob, the first set of twins. A scammer, a trickster, a con artist, and growing up in most of his adult life in complete conflict with his twin brother. Estranged from his family, he eventually was tricked and conned by his father-in-law. He was a poor father and with clear favourites himself. He was a poor husband to Leah and to Leah and Rachel's maidservants. Jacob, you could say, was a troubled man. He struggled with God. He fought battles with God. He was determined to do it his way, legally or illegally. Jacob was his own man. But God was not going to let him go. And when Jacob was at his lowest, even then he still wrestled and wanted to bargain his way out. But God gave him this promise: I am with you and will not leave you. Jacob had real trust issues. Maybe it's because he knew how conniving he could be, that he didn't trust others, but he equally struggled to trust God and to give up his own independence. But God did not give up on him. We then come to Judah, Leah's fourth son. He was not a favoured child. He was not particularly high up in the rankings of things. And in the attempt to murder his brother, Joseph, he was the one that spoke up and suggested selling him as a slave instead. I often think if they were actually to do an EastEnders episode about family life, Jacob's family and Judah and everybody really should be featuring in it, because there is murder, intrigue and backstabbing all over the place. The family politics that go on in this family are just awful when you think about it. He abandons his daughter-in-law. Having made a promise, he then doesn't keep on it and abandons her. And she, Tamar, tricks him into sleeping with her. Judah has control over her life. It's interesting that it's Judah that can decide whether she lives or dies, rather than her own father. But Tamar is clever, and Tamar puts protection in for herself. Eventually, Judah becomes and takes over the lead role in negotiating with his brothers and with Joseph, and leading to reconciliation. And so we have Tamar, the first woman in our family tree, considered an outsider, a Canaanite, abandoned and rejected, widowed twice and forgotten about. But she is named by Matthew as part of God's family, important, essential, needed for God's plan to work through. Her twins, Perez and Zerah, are both named, which is interesting because Esau is not named with Jacob. And the story of their birth is important, which is kind of why Tamar is named. It's bringing that whole time to mind. The people of Israel would have known it. Those reading this story for the first time would have realised who and what was happening there. It's at this point the family are going to move to Egypt, and Judah's family is going. It's likely that Perez was brought up in Egypt, initially in comfort. And our next list of names, we are in Egypt or wandering through the deserts and in the wilderness. These are names where stories aren't attached to. We don't know anything really else about them other than that they are a father or a son. Hezron, Ram, Amminadab, Nahshon. But there is one thing we do know. Amminadab, his daughter, married Aaron, and Nahshon became a leader of the tribe of Judah in Moses' time as we wander through the deserts, learning to trust God, learning to walk with God. And as we enter the promised land, so Salmon is there, married to Rahab, the second woman in this list of names, a prostitute who betrayed her own people, a believer in the God of Israel, a woman of faith and acclaimed in the New Testament. Rahab rescued out of Jericho. And then we come to our next list of names. Boaz, a prominent man in his community. You can read about him in the book of Ruth, but it's interesting that the book is called Ruth and not Boaz. Ruth, the third woman, a Moabite, a hated group of people, a widow, but brought into God's family, an essential part, a love story, a restoring, a rescuing. Obed, then Jesse. Two people who are famous because either they are part of the story of Ruth and Boaz, or because actually who their son and grandson is, David. King David, a shepherd boy, done good. Described as a man after God's own heart. He did some amazing things, and you would think that Matthew would actually draw on how brilliant David is. If you think about David, some of the first thing that comes to mind is David and Goliath, the great warrior, how he is a writer of the Psalms, and many of the songs we sing may have come from David. But that's not what Matthew draws out. No, Matthew wants to draw our attention not to his military accomplishments, but to perhaps one of his greatest failures. David has not gone to war as he should have done. He has not been the king who has set out to go and protect his people. Rather, he sent others to do his job. He sent others to be there at the lead. And staying at home, he spotted Uriah's wife and has committed adultery. Trying hard to cover up his crime, he then does a series of things which don't succeed, so thinks the best solution is to just murder Uriah. I'm not sure that's called the best solution, but that's what David arranges. You see, it's a story about a misuse of power. A story that could have ended everything. But David repents, and he marries Uriah's widow. It's a story of how a man gets it so incredibly wrong that you think there is no way forward. And yet, he recognizes his mistake, and he comes in true repentance, and God forgives. He does not hold a grudge. There is reconciliation. There is healing. And Solomon is born. He is a wise and yet incredibly foolish king with an eye for the ladies. He rebuilds the temple of God, a grand temple. And it all seems to start so well, but it ends so very badly, with his kingdom falling apart. As he marries more and more wives, so he moves further away from God and eventually stops listening to God. He is divided in who he worships. Other people and other gods get in the way of his relationship with God, and it impacts on how he governs. It impacts on how he parents. He has that many wives and concubines. I'm surprised he can keep up with how many children he has. But Rehoboam eventually takes the throne. And Rehoboam is arrogant and listens to unwise advice. The kingdom becomes divided, and the family is at war with itself. Rehoboam is angry and greedy and without compassion. You would think, as he introduces idolatry practices and worshipping of other gods, that everything is going to go disastrously wrong. But as things progress, he too repents. And it says here, there was some good in Judah. And unlike Israel, it is saved from disaster. Abijah becomes next, and he calls the people to rely on God. Judah is turning back to their true king, God. And things appear to be going well. But Asa, who also does right in the sight of God, and is described as being like David, becomes prideful and self-reliant, and therefore he then starts to not depend on God, and he never repents, but moves away. Jehoshaphat. There's not much written here, other than he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Jehoram, an evil ruler who walked in the ways of Israel. Things are going downhill again. What I find interesting is whenever they're describing a king as doing something bad, they quite often go, they walked in the way of Israel. Israel at this time was really bad. But Jesus comes from the line of Judah. We have our three missing kings. And they really are bad. There's also a queen in there. Before we get to Uzziah, initially, he does follow God. It seems like there has been a turnaround. There has been a change, and actually Judah is returning and becoming back to their God. But Uzziah becomes very successful, and his arrogance grows, and so does his pride. And he enters the temple into an area he's not permitted to go to. And he ends the years of his reign with leprosy. His son Jotham co-governs and eventually takes the throne. And he walks steadfastly before the Lord. What a great thing to have on your tomb, to walk steadfastly with God. Jotham did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Jotham, though, appears not to have taught his children how to walk with God, because Ahaz did not walk with the Lord or do what was right in the eyes of God, but worshipped other gods. The grandchild, Hezekiah, Jotham's grandchild, trusted in God and brought back the Passover and reinstated religious reforms. He too, though, became very proud. There's a pattern here of doing really well and thinking, haven't I done great, when actually God's done great, and then becoming too proud and rejecting God. And Hezekiah falls into that pattern. But at a later point, he humbles himself and leads the people before God to do the same, saving Judah, the nation. Manasseh did evil in the eyes of God and worshipped other gods. Now, I can't understand if the other three kings have been removed because what they did was pretty bad, why Manasseh is still in. Because I would put what he did down as evil. For he sacrificed his own son to other gods. He practiced sorcery and refused to listen to the prophets. You would feel that that is it. There's a line in the sand and he's crossed it. But right at the end of his life, towards the end, he changed. God was able to break through that hard shell and to break into this man's life and to get to reach the places where evil seemed to have taken root. And Manasseh repented. and he was able to change his ways. God, a gracious and forgiving God. His son Ammon, though, wanted nothing to do with God, and he continued the pattern of walking away from God. Before we reach Josiah. Now, Josiah renewed the covenant with God. He reinstated the Passover and reformed the religious practices. He seemed to be doing everything right. He removed the cultic centres and the pagan idols, and it feels like there could be a turnaround for Judah, the nation. But Josiah is just a brief bit of light in actually what is going downhill rapidly. As we have another missing king before we get to Jeconiah, who is only king for 3 months before the exile comes. And he's taken into exile. And a puppet king is on the throne. Babylon are in charge. The next set of names is very much the exile. The next set of names are those who return. The most prominent name is Zerubbabel, a prominent man who is involved in the return to Jerusalem. He's involved in governing Judah at the time of the building of the temple. And all the other names after him are unknowns. All we know is that Zerubbabel was the father of Abihud, and Abihud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Matan, and Matan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, who's going to get married to Mary. We don't know anything else about these people's lives. We don't know whether they were great or small or indifferent. But they were essential in God's plan and part of Jesus' family. And it was that line, that royal line, that gave Jesus the right to be called king. Jesus has got some serious skeletons in his closet, some serious problems in his family. God's family is messed up when you read it. But God loved them and he never abandoned them. Now, I know my family tree a little bit, and it's my story to tell. But I can't share my story because it's not only my story, it's my mum's and my dad's story to tell. And in my family tree, there is some skeletons. But God has loved them. In my family tree, there are also a huge number of unknowns and ordinary people, not famous for anything, just got up, went to work, did a job, came home, carried on with life. Nothing exciting happens. Rebecca has pointed out that her friends have done their DNA stuff, and they've got really interesting DNA. She goes, there's no point doing ours. We lived in a field somewhere in Suffolk for 600 years. There's nothing there. It's not exciting. It's not thrilling. But it's still loved by God. It doesn't matter if your family feels like it can't get any worse. It's still loved by God. And it doesn't matter if your family is still unimportant and it just feels like you're going through the routine of the day. Nothing exciting happens. It's still loved by God. Jesus can relate to your family, to your situation. We have a king from a royal line who knows what it's like to be ordinary, who knows what it's like that when people go, ooh, but Your mum's a teenage mum who's not married. Joseph's not really your dad. He knows what it's like to have shame on the family line. He knows what it's like to be somebody that people might talk about behind corners, in whispered breaths. But he knows what it's like, and he loves his family. His family of misfits, his families of unknown, his family who are not pure blood or all Jewish, but his family of Gentiles, of Hittites and Canaanites and Moabites. His family that has grown to include every nation, tribe, and creed on this world. And Jesus is not ashamed of any of them, but is ready to give his love, grace, and forgiveness if we are ready to accept. He came to an unknown woman and an unknown father and was born in a little out-of-the-way place because he wants to know us today.